what we're going to do is take a look at how we can modify lights. And there's several different ways to do so. We can diffuse the light, we can bounce or reflect the light. There are many different approaches. But the reason I find this really useful to do without using actual modifiers, like softboxes or umbrellas, is because when you see how to modify the light, you can look at a modifier and go, oh, I know how the light's going to change. So for example, when I show you how the light looks when I diffuse it, with just a basic diffuser, well then if you see a softbox, you see diffusion on an umbrella, you'll go, oh, now I know how the light is going to change. So we're going to take a look at the ways that you modify light so you can examine different modifiers, and just by looking at them, know how they're going to change the light. So I'm actually going to start with a bare bulb, no modification at all. And we're going to use that as our starting point to compare as we build up and as we modify and change the light. So I know that I want to be at ISO 200, 1/200th of a second, and f11. That's the exposure that I want to be at. So I'm going to use my meter. I'm going to put my settings right there, and I'm going to make sure the light reads f11 as my starting point. f11, perfect. So let me take that first image. All right, so examining this image, it's exactly what I expected because I know what direct light looks like when it's not modified. It's giving me really bright specular highlights and really dark shadows. And if you look at the shadow on the side of her face, it's very abrupt. The transition from shadow to highlight is immediate. And so what this does is it emphasizes texture, and it really sculpts the face, but in a not totally flattering way, but it gives me a lot of control. So what does this mean to you? If you are looking at a modifier and you see that some of that bare bulb is hitting the subject, you know that the light is going to be harder. It's going to have some qualities like this. Typically those modifiers, where there's still some of the bare bulb light hitting the subject, typically what those modifiers doing are they're changing the focus of the light, or they're changing the intensity of it, or they're changing the spill, but they're not usually changing the quality very much. So for example, this would be something like a zoom reflector. Okay. So what a zoom reflector is going to do is, depending on how far you have it on the strobe itself, it's going to change how much spill you allow the light, but it's still going to have a lot of that bare bulb. So I know, just looking at this, that it's going to produce hard specular light like we have here. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to start introducing modifications, ways that I can change this light. And the way I want to start with first is diffusing the light. I already know that when I diffuse the light, I soften the light. The shadow transition becomes more gentle, more gradual. I also know that the highlights won't be as bright. I also know the contrast is cut down a little bit. Instead of using a modifier, I'm simply going to take a piece of diffusion, or in this case, it's going to be a reflector, and it's the inside of that reflector, the diffusion. And we're going to place it between my light and my subject. And this is going to serve to diffuse the light. All right. Thank you. All right. All right, so placing this in between the light and my subject, you can actually see with your naked eye what's happening here. It got a lot softer. Now before I take a picture, I know that I have to meter again, because I know that when I add diffusion into a scene, whether it's just a piece of diffusion or a diffusion on an umbrella or whatever it may be, when you introduce diffusion, it cuts down on light. And actually, you can buy pieces of diffusion that are sold in stops of light. So actually they cut the light. So there's a half stop cut and a quarter cut and a full cut. And so if you actually know how much light that diffusion is cutting, you wouldn't even need to meter. You could just adjust your exposure. But in this case, I'm going to take a measurement. So let's take a meter reading. Okay, so it gives me F8. So it gave me F8, which means I needed to open up a stop. And so you can see that the light gets much softer. And the places you can see it is if you look at those shadows, right? If you look at the shadow of the hair on the neck or the shadow of the jawline, you see that the transition from shadow to highlight is much softer. And you can also see it in the highlight and shadow area. It's not quite as much contrast. but I want you to take a look at something. If you take a look at the diffusion panel, the light is very, very close to that panel. And this is how I think of it. I think of it like a bucket of water. If I'm taking a bucket of water and I'm throwing it against a wall, if I'm really close to that wall, the water stays really focused. But if I can back that light up or move the wall forward and I throw that same bucket of water, the light or the water has more time to spread out. Because that piece of diffusion is so close, the light doesn't have time to spread out. So it's only lighting like a tiny portion of that diffuser. So if I would like to make the light source larger or softer, I need to put a little bit of distance between the two. So if I want even softer light, what I can do is bring this diffusion forward. As I bring it forward, the light is going to have time to spread out, fill more of that diffusion panel, and therefore it becomes a larger light source. And also by bringing that diffusion closer to my subject, the larger the light source is compared to the subject, the softer the light. So what's happening in this instance is that the light hits the diffusion and the diffusion becomes the light source. So if it's hitting the diffusion and it becomes that large, now your light modifier, your light source is that large. So I can make it a large, soft light source. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing, but now I'm gonna bring this in very, very, very close to my subject. Okay, so now I'm gonna take a meter reading again, just to check. And if I look at the diffuser, now it's spread out and it's filling a lot more of that surface area. So it's going to make it larger and softer. Okay, just about the same amount of light. Let's try this again. Exact same thing. All right, so you can see the light on her face is so much softer now. And the place you can tell it really, really exaggerated is if you look at the highlight side of the face, those specular highlights. In the first shot, the skin looks kind of shiny, maybe even a little bit greasy, but in the second shot, when I brought that diffusion in closer, light source is larger because it's closer, and it's larger because the light can spread out, and therefore, it's softer. The highlights aren't as bright, and the transitions are just a little bit more subtle. So, I actually see a drastic difference just by moving that diffusion in. All right, so what does this mean to you? First of all, it means you can actually make really soft light that's beautiful, even if you don't have any modifiers at all. All you need is some piece of diffusion, which could be the inside of your 5-in-1 reflector. Or you can do a DIY, do-it-yourself softbox or soft light using some kind of semi-translucent material like curtain shears or a bed sheet or even a shower curtain. It's doing the same fundamental thing. But the next thing this tells you is whatever modifier you have, when it has diffusion on it, it means that it is softening the light, spreading it out, and making it a larger light source. So that front diffusion is making it so the light is spread out. So for example, when you have an octabox like this, and I see on the front of it that I have diffusion material, I know that this is going to be a softer, more diffused light source. Now as a note, if you look at the distance between the bare bulb there and the diffusion material, it's deeper than this, right? And the reason that there's more distance is because I wanted to give the light more time to spread out. Well, they actually do make deep softboxes, and that's part of the goal of the deep softbox. It makes the light even softer. It also does something where it allows you to better control where the light falls. But for smaller modifiers like this, there's a workaround built into the softbox. And this is an inner piece of diffusion, an inner baffle. So what happens is when the light source hits this piece of diffusion, it spreads out. It softens, it spreads out, takes up more surface area, and then that larger area moves forward and hits the front piece of diffusion. So it's just making sure you're making use of the entire surface area of the diffusion material in whatever light source you're using. So this becomes especially important if you're using a big softbox that isn't very deep. You need to do as much as possible to try to get that light to spread out. So what this means for you is you can make beautiful light, even if you don't have any modifiers at all, just a piece of diffusion. You could do this with a shower curtain, a bed sheet, anything that's semi-translucent, it cuts the light and it softens light. You can make it yourself. but it also means you can look at a modifier with diffusion and know what it's going to do. You know that it's going to soften the light. You know it's going to spread the light out. So the first way that you can modify light, besides being direct light, is you can diffuse that light.